The phone rang in the middle of the night, shrill and relentless, like it was offended I hadn't answered sooner. I picked up on the second ring. "Olivia, we're done," Caleb Whitmore said. His voice was calm, almost amused. "Your role doesn't justify your cost anymore. Frankly, you're replaceable." There it was. No buffer, no pretense, no human resources, just a CEO delivering a firing like he was canceling a software subscription. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask what I was working on. He spoke as if the decision had already aged into something boring. He continued, "This company doesn't need someone who overthinks assets. We need speed. You're too expensive for what you do." The words sat heavy, cold, deliberate. 14 years collapsed into a sentence designed to humiliate, not explain. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. Before continuing, I want to mention that some details in this story are fictional, aided by technology to better convey the message and emotional impact. I hope you enjoyed it, and if today isn't the right time, please pause and take care of yourself. I was vice president of asset restructuring when factories hemorrhaged cash. I stopped the bleeding when lenders tightened terms. I bought time. I didn't chase growth fantasies. I kept the company alive while executives like Caleb practiced sounding decisive in board meetings. Caleb had been CEO for 8 months. He liked to say things like hard choices and clean cuts. He believed authority meant motion, not understanding, in meetings. He waved off my numbers and smiled through my warnings. "You worry too much," he once told me. "We'll deal with the asset side later." The call ended without a goodbye. A minute passed. Then my phone buzzed again. A message from Caleb. Efficient to the point of arrogance. "Send over all asset documentation. Effective immediately. Full turnover. Every valuation. Every buyer conversation. Every restructuring plan that kept the company solvent." He wanted it all. Neatly packaged. Handed over like spoils. I stared at the screen, feeling the pressure compress inward. Not panic, control. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I typed a single word and hit send. Understood. Then I opened the files he thought he owned and prepared to give him exactly what he asked for. Do you know, some people listen to stories like these and quietly recognize themselves in them. If you want them to know that those feelings are real, that they didn't imagine them, you can stay and follow this channel. I didn't sleep after the call, not because I was fired, but because I kept replaying the work he never bothered to look at. Every crisis the company survived had fingerprints, and none of them were his. When demand collapsed 3 years earlier, I froze expansion and rerouted capital before lenders noticed. When a supplier defaulted, I restructured the contracts overnight and avoided penalties that would have triggered cross defaults. Those decisions didn't make headlines. They kept payroll running. They kept doors open. The 3 factories everyone loved to talk about were never trophies. They were leverage. I kept them operational, compliant, and quietly market-ready, because they were the only assets capable of absorbing debt if the market turned hostile. I said that in meetings. I said it slowly. I said it with numbers attached. Caleb laughed. "Factories don't negotiate. Executives do." He repeated it like a slogan. Like confidence could override balance sheets. The board nodded while he spoke. Later, when liquidity stabilized, he took credit for decisive leadership. My name never appeared in the slide deck. I became a cost center, a cautious voice, someone who slowed momentum. Caleb framed survival as stagnation and risk as courage. The unfairness wasn't subtle anymore. It was rehearsed. What he never mentioned, and what no one challenged, was the paperwork signed during the last refinancing. The board wanted speed then, too. And they granted me independent authority over asset restructuring to protect the company from exactly this kind of impulsive decision-making. I remembered that clause clearly as the pressure mounted. They praised his vision. They questioned my expense. And all the while, the leverage they depended on still answered to me. That imbalance would soon become impossible to ignore, no matter how loudly he tried controlling the narrative internally. I opened the contract long after the city went quiet. Not with anger, but with focus. This document had followed me through mergers, refinancing rounds, and board reshuffles. I knew its weight, even if others treated it like background noise. The termination language was blunt, almost careless. No progressive discipline, no formal review, no transitional protocol. That omission mattered. I traced the paragraph slowly, letting memory catch up with ink. In the section titled Asset Continuity, a sentence surfaced that had once sparked an argument in the boardroom. In the event of abrupt executive termination without due process, authority over designated restructuring transactions shifts into preservation mode under the last appointed officer of record. That officer was me. Preservation mode wasn't symbolic. It froze discretionary interference and insulated asset negotiations from executive impulse. The board approved it years earlier. After a near disaster caused by rushed divestment, they wanted stability if leadership panicked. They wanted someone boring and precise, holding the wheel. Caleb hadn't read that far. He fired me the fastest way possible, proud of the efficiency. In doing so, he flipped a switch he didn't know existed. The moment my role ended without procedure, the contracts moved quietly, automatically, exactly as written. I didn't celebrate. I organized. I reviewed the deal folders I'd kept current by habit. 3 factories, 3 buyer groups already vetted, funded, and waiting. Each agreement contained identical language, acknowledging binding authority only through my signature until final close. At the time, it seemed like caution. Now it was clarity. Emails began arriving before dawn. Polite, curious, concerned. One message asked if recent leadership changes affected transaction authority. I replied with a single attachment and a neutral line confirming continuity. No one questioned it. Lawyers didn't argue clauses they themselves had approved. Banks didn't pause. The system recognized what people overlooked. By sunrise, control had fully returned, not through confrontation, but through compliance. Caleb still believed he'd removed an obstacle. He didn't realize he'd activated a safeguard designed for moments exactly like this, one that required no permission to operate. And it was irreversible now. I didn't waste time thinking about fairness. Fairness was irrelevant now. What mattered was execution. I made 3 calls before the sun came up. No announcements, no warnings, just quiet confirmations. Each corporation had been waiting, patient and cautious. For the moment, I signaled readiness. They already knew the assets. They already trusted the numbers. This changes nothing. I told the first executive, the structure remains intact. We're ready, he replied. No surprise, no negotiation. The second call was shorter, $5.5 billion. I said, final. A pause. Then, understood. The third buyer didn't even ask about price. Your signature still holds, it does. I said, for now. These weren't emotional conversations. They were procedural. The factories had been positioned months earlier. Environmental reviews completed. Workforce obligations mapped. I had kept them transaction ready because that was my job. I wasn't improvising. I was finishing work already done, by midday. Draft agreements were locked. Legal teams exchanged documents without drama. No renegotiations. No last-minute leverage games. The value stood exactly where it always had, $5.5 billion. Clean and defensible. What no one outside those calls realized was where the money would not go. The contracts were precise. Proceeds were routed through preservation accounts tied to asset continuity. Not corporate operating revenue. That wasn't retaliation. It was compliance. The mechanism existed to prevent reckless leadership from misusing strategic exits. Caleb had activated it the moment he chose speed over process. I approved the final signatures without ceremony. No victory lap, no satisfaction, just closure later that afternoon. My phone buzzed again. A message from Caleb. Sharper now. Why hasn't Treasury received confirmation? I didn't answer immediately. I reviewed the executed agreements one last time, then replied with a single sentence. The transactions closed as authorized. The silence that followed told me everything. The deals were done, the assets were gone, and the cash was exactly where the system said it should be, far beyond his reach. There was no applause, only the calm certainty that consequences had begun moving faster than his authority could ever restrain again now. If you're starting to see where this is going, type 1 in the comments. I noticed the shift before he called. Numbers don't vanish quietly, they echo. The balance sheet updated, and 3 assets no longer sat where Caleb expected them. Within minutes, my phone lit up. His message wasn't polished anymore. "Where are the factories?" it read. He followed with a call. The calm confidence was gone, replaced by urgency. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "Treasury shows a gap." I let him speak. He accused accounting, blamed timing, then landed where he always did. "You moved something you shouldn't have." By noon, his lawyer was CC'd on everything. The tone hardened. "We will pursue immediate legal remedies." The email warned, "Unauthorized divestiture constitutes material breach." It was loud, performative, designed to frighten people who hadn't read their own paperwork. I replied once. One line, no commentary, no defense. I quoted the clause exactly as written, with the section number and date of approval. Authority over designated restructuring transactions transfers to preservation mode upon termination without process. I attached nothing else. The response thread stalled. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The lawyer asked for time to review. Caleb sent another message. "Shorter now. Explain." I didn't. Explanation invites argument. Contracts don't argue. They either apply or they don't. The system had already answered him, and it wasn't interested in his tone. Late afternoon brought a final attempt at pressure. "Reverse the transactions." He wrote, "This is escalating." I imagined the lawyer rereading the clause, tracing signatures, recognizing the trap he'd stepped into. Then the email stopped. No threat, no demand, no follow-up. Silence is different when it comes from counsel. It means certainty has changed sides. That evening, I closed my laptop knowing the fight had shifted. Caleb had questions. The documents had answers. And for the first time since the call, he was the one waiting. I stayed composed, watching his authority drain through procedure. Every demand met a citation. Every threat met silence. Power doesn't shout when it's real. It files, timestamps, and waits. By nightfall, resistance collapsed into compliance, and the record stood unchallenged, without appeal or negotiation remaining. The meeting was called an emergency, but the panic started before anyone sat down. I wasn't in the room, yet I could picture it. Screens lit with red numbers, voices overlapping, confidence evaporating by the minute. The issue was simple and terrifying. A major loan was reaching maturity, and the collateral that once justified it no longer existed. 3 factories had anchored the credit line. Without them, the balance sheet couldn't support renewal. Liquidity projections collapsed in real time. Caleb tried to control the narrative. "This is a temporary reporting gap," he said. According to someone who later called me, "The assets are in transition." He spoke fast, leaning on certainty the way he always did. It didn't work. A director interrupted him. Then another. Questions came sharp and unforgiving. Why hadn't the board been informed? Why had Treasury confirmed the exits but not the proceeds? Why was preservation language suddenly governing asset flow? No one asked my name at first. They didn't have to. The silence around it said enough. When legal finally spoke, the room shifted. The answer was procedural, not emotional. The transactions were valid. The authority was correctly exercised. There was no asset security left for the loan coming due. Renegotiation would require new guarantees the company didn't have. Caleb pushed back. "Reverse it," he demanded. "We can unwind this." The reply was calm. "We can't." That was when a familiar voice cut in. One board member, older than the rest, spoke carefully. "This is exactly why we structured it this way," she said. "Olivia warned us years ago about executive risk. She reminded them who had insisted on preservation authority and who had signed it. The room went quiet. Panic didn't disappear. It concentrated. I felt no urge to celebrate. Satisfaction arrived differently. Quietly. The system had functioned as designed. Decisions met consequences without drama or speeches. By the time the meeting ended, Caleb wasn't issuing directives anymore. He was answering questions, and the board understood something they should have remembered sooner. Control doesn't belong to titles. It belongs to whoever prepared for this moment. The shift from panic to clarity happened faster than Caleb expected. Once the board understood what had occurred, the questions stopped circling and started landing. Someone finally said it plainly. I wasn't an accessory to the asset system. I was the key holder. I had been appointed years earlier to centralize control during restructuring. Not for prestige, but for continuity. Every asset pathway, every fallback mechanism, every preservation trigger routed through my authorization. That structure wasn't theoretical. It was operational, deliberate, and approved because the board feared reckless leadership more than market volatility. Caleb didn't accept that quietly. He redirected the blame immediately. HR mishandled the termination. He insisted, this wasn't my intent. He framed the situation as an administrative failure, something procedural that could be reversed once the right people were reprimanded. HR didn't argue. They didn't defend themselves either. They produced records. An email thread surfaced, time-stamped deep into the night. Caleb's instructions were clear, written without ambiguity. Terminate immediately. No review, no transition. Execute now. The language was his, sharp and unmistakable. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a command. The room changed when that message appeared. The story Caleb had been telling collapsed under its own weight. He wasn't reacting to a process failure. He had created it, and in doing so, he had removed the only person authorized to manage the company's most critical assets. I watched the realization spread. Justice didn't announce itself. It aligned. The board saw the chain clearly now. From impulse to outcome, every safeguard they'd approved had functioned exactly as designed. Caleb's voice lowered. Questions replaced declarations. He asked whether anything could still be fixed. The answer was careful but final. The system had already moved past discretion. For the first time since the call, my role was acknowledged without resistance. Not as an employee, but as the mechanism they had trusted when pressure mattered most. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The truth had been documented, preserved, and revealed without emotion. Justice doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives when denial runs out of room to hide, and accountability finally followed. I learned about Caleb's suspension the same way I learned about everything else now. Through restrained language and careful timing. The board didn't announce it publicly at first. They called it an administrative pause. A neutral phrase meant to slow panic. Internally, it was clear. Authority had been removed. An internal investigation followed immediately. Compliance teams requested records. Legal froze approvals. And audit trails were pulled apart line by line. No one argued anymore. They calculated exposure. Every decision Caleb rushed now carried a cost estimate beside it. Accountability finally had a budget. The market noticed before the press did. Stock dipped at opening, then slid harder as analysts connected the missing collateral to the debt schedule. Confidence evaporated fast. Investors don't forgive uncertainty, especially when it looks self-inflicted. By midday, the drop was no longer technical. It was fear, priced honestly. I watched without celebrating. Satisfaction came quietly. In the way systems settle after imbalance corrects itself. This wasn't revenge. It was math finishing a sentence someone else started. By the end of the week, the investigation widened. Emails were subpoenaed. Decision chains reconstructed. Caleb's name appeared often. Always next to urgency, never next to review. Suspension became inevitability, not punishment. Then another detail surfaced, almost casually. One of the 3 factories had already been integrated into a competitor's network. The sale hadn't just removed collateral, it had strengthened someone else's supply chain. The board hadn't anticipated that outcome, but it was irreversible. The irony landed without effort. Caleb's obsession with speed had delivered advantage directly into rival hands. The company lost leverage, market position, and credibility in a single arc, all traceable to one night, when the announcement finally went public. The language stayed polite. Leadership changes, strategic reassessment. Shareholders understood anyway. Collapse doesn't require drama. It requires alignment between mistake and consequence. I closed the report and stepped away. The fall was complete, not because anyone pushed, but because gravity had been ignored for too long. What remained was silence, accountability, and a lesson no executive handbook teaches when arrogance outruns process and consequences become permanent. I didn't rush into the next chapter. I let the noise fade, the headlines settle, and the urgency drain out of my system. When the call finally came, it wasn't dramatic. It was precise, respectful, and refreshingly honest. They offered me a higher role with clearer authority and cleaner boundaries. No theatrics, no heroic language, just responsibility aligned with trust. I reviewed the contract once. Then again, not searching for traps, but appreciating the absence of them. This time, the expectations were written plainly. So were the protections. I signed without hesitation. There was no sense of victory, only relief. I didn't need to punish anyone further. The system had already done that work. I wasn't carrying anger anymore. I was carrying experience, and it felt lighter than I expected. My new office overlooked operations instead of politics. Decisions moved through process, not ego. When issues surfaced, people asked questions instead of issuing commands. It was quieter, steadier, and infinitely more effective. During onboarding, someone mentioned the acquisition almost in passing. One of the manufacturing facilities had exceeded early performance targets. I nodded, already aware of the metrics. Then the sentence landed fully. It was one of the three. The realization didn't sting. It clarified. The company I now worked for wasn't just my next employer. It was the primary buyer. The same firm that had trusted my numbers when others dismissed them. The same leadership that respected restraint over bravado. Nothing about that felt ironic. It felt consistent. I didn't bring up the past. They didn't ask. We shared an understanding built on execution, not explanation. The factories were thriving. The supply chain was stronger. The strategy was intact. As I settled into the rhythm of my new role, I understood something fundamental. Moving on doesn't require erasing what happened. It requires placing it where it belongs. I had done my work. I had honored the system. And now, free from the need to react, I could finally build without looking over my shoulder. Fully aware that calm is the strongest position of all. It suited me better now. I heard the news on a quiet morning, delivered without drama. The company I once held together was restructuring again, this time under external supervision. Analysts spoke calmly about missed obligations, leadership failure, and preventable risk. No one mentioned my name, and that felt appropriate. I remembered the night it started. The call, the dismissal, the certainty in Caleb's voice. Everything that followed unfolded exactly as the documents predicted. Clauses were activated, authority transferred, assets moved. Systems don't get angry. They respond. There was no urge to celebrate. Collapse is not entertainment when you understand how easily it could have been avoided. Justice, in this case, wasn't loud or personal. It was procedural. The silence afterward felt earned, heavy, and complete, like a ledger finally balanced at last. I closed the article and returned to my work. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just followed the system they ignored. When I look back on everything that happened, the lesson isn't about revenge or winning. It's about understanding where real power lives. It lives in preparation, in quiet competence, in knowing the system well enough to trust it when emotions would only make things worse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush to prove anyone wrong. I stayed steady, and that steadiness carried me through the moment that could have broken me. There's something deeply human in that choice. We're often taught to react loudly when we're treated unfairly, but sometimes dignity is the stronger response. Sometimes the most meaningful justice is simply allowing consequences to unfold exactly as they should. That doesn't just protect you professionally, it protects you emotionally. It lets you move forward without bitterness weighing you down. If you listened all the way to the end, I'm grateful you stayed with me through this journey. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now, if this story resonated with you? Or reminded you of a moment when staying calm mattered? Leave a comment below. A simple like or share helps these stories reach others who might need them. And if you'd like to hear more real, thoughtful stories like this one, consider subscribing. Sometimes, knowing you're not alone makes all the difference.